Forget the pristine wooden barn. Forget the little drummer boy.
Right.
Forget the cruel innkeeper pointing to a neon no vacancy sign as the snow gently falls. I mean, almost everything our modern culture pictures about the arrival of the historical Jesus is, frankly, just a medieval invention.
Yeah, it really is. It's a sanitized two-dimensional greeting card. And the tragedy of that is that by sanitizing the story, we completely lose the staggering geopolitical and, well, the theological weight of what actually happened in the first century.
Absolutely. Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're stripping away all those myths. We are preparing to stretch our historical understanding and really our imaginations to their absolute limits.
We have to.
Yeah.
Because we're going to examine the arrival of the king not as a fable, but as a rigid historical, legal, and cosmic reality.
Yeah, and to really grasp the weight of this arrival, I want you, the listener, to just imagine something with me for a second. I want you to imagine 400 years of total unbroken silence.
And that is a staggering expanse of time to comprehend. I mean, for you listening right now, just subtract 400 years from our modern era.
Right, so you're suddenly back in, what, the early 1600s?
Exactly, the early 1600s.
So you're back before the steam engine, before electricity, before the founding of the United States. I mean, think about all the empires that have risen and fallen across the globe in that amount of time. The scientific revolutions, the billions of lives lived, fought, and lost.
Yeah.
Now take that vast, churning ocean of time and apply it to the ancient nation of Israel. For 4 centuries, it was like receiving no new revelation, no angelic visitations, no fresh miracles, just absolutely no word from heaven.
Yeah, and in scholarly historical circles, we usually refer to this as the intertestamental period. Because since the prophet Malachi spoke his final, really haunting words pointing toward a coming messenger, the prophetic voice just completely ceased.
The heavens were brass.
Exactly. But we have to be incredibly careful not to misinterpret that silence. I mean, it was not a peaceful, pastoral quiet.
No, it was deafening. It was absolute geopolitical trauma. I kind of want to paint the picture of what the Jewish people endured while they were just waiting in the dark.
It's vital context.
Right. So it starts with the brutal, lightning-fast conquest of Alexander the Great. He just sweeps across the known world, and he doesn't just conquer land, he forces Greek culture onto everyone.
Right. The historical term for that is Hellenization. I mean, Alexander wanted the entire world to speak Greek, to think like Greeks, to adopt Greek philosophy and religion.
He even built gymnasiums in Jerusalem, right?
He did, which was a profound cultural shock for them. It was this attempt to subtly erode the Hebraic worldview. But, the subtle erosion didn't last. That cultural pressure cooker eventually led to the horrors inflicted by the Seleucid king, Antiochus Epiphanes.
Antiochus Epiphanes. I mean, that is a name that should send shivers down the spine of anyone studying this era. He didn't just want political control. He wanted to systematically erase Jewish identity from the face of the earth.
He really did.
He banned circumcision. He burned the Torah. But the absolute climax of his madness was what he did to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem.
Yeah, he committed the ultimate desecration. He walked right into the sacred precincts. He erected a statue of Zeus directly over the holy altar and literally sacrificed a pig on it.
Wow.
I mean, to a first-century Jewish mind, this was an apocalyptic level of defilement. It was psychological and spiritual trauma on a national scale.
And you just can't push a people that far without a violent reaction. I mean, that unimaginable desecration triggered the Maccabean revolt. And this wasn't some clean, organized military campaign. This was years of brutal, bloody guerrilla warfare. You have a family of priests taking up swords and launching asymmetric attacks against a massive empire. And incredibly, they actually won a brief period of independence.
They did. They pulled it off.
Yeah.
But just as the dust begins to settle, just as they think they might finally breathe and establish their own sovereign kingdom, here comes the crushing iron boot of the Roman Empire.
Right. The most lethal, organized military machine the ancient world had ever seen. The Romans march in, and they are clever. They don't just occupy the land directly. They rule locally through a client king.
And Herod the Great.
Herod the Great. And Herod is just this fascinating, terrifying figure. I mean, he's an architectural genius. He's building massive aqueducts and expanding the temple. But he is notoriously murderous and insanely paranoid.
Oh, paranoia defined his entire reign. I mean, he was so terrified of losing his illegitimate grip on power that he executed his own wife.
Jeez.
He executed his mother-in-law and several of his own sons the moment he even suspected they were plotting against him. Actually, Augustus Caesar famously joked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son.
That is dark. So, put yourself in the sandals of a Jewish peasant living in Galilee or Judea at this time. You are functioning in a geopolitical powder keg. You're holding on to these ancient, sacred promises from the Torah and the prophets about a coming deliverer. But you are doing so in a pressure cooker of crushing Roman taxation, random violence, and a psychotic local king. You're exhausted. You are traumatized.
And because of that, the national expectation was entirely militaristic. I mean, the people were waiting for the sky to just rip open. They wanted a divine general to crash through the clouds on a war horse, swinging a sword of fire to slaughter the Roman legions and decapitate Herod.
Which makes sense. But that is the profound paradox of this story. When eternity finally and violently intersected with human history, it wasn't a military conquest.
Not at all.
It was arguably the most vulnerable arrival imaginable. And to understand the architecture of this arrival, we're going to examine the text today through three distinct historical and biblical lenses. We'll look at John's cosmic theology, Matthew's highly technical legal courtroom, and Luke's gritty historical reality.
And we really must synthesize those three lenses to see exactly where this fits in the administrative timeline of Scripture. We are transitioning out of the generations of Adam, which is a lineage entirely defined by failure, brokenness, and the curse of sin. And we are stepping into the generation of Jesus Christ, the last Adam.
So let's begin outside of time. Because before we can understand the physical manger in Bethlehem, we kind of have to step outside of the timeline entirely to understand the fundamental nature of who is arriving.
We do.
The Apostle John begins his account not in a stable, but in eternity past. So we're looking at John chapter 1, verse 14.
And the opening of John's narrative is just a theological masterpiece. He writes, "And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us."
To really grasp the magnitude of that sentence, we have to dive into the language. He uses the Greek term logos for the word.
And this is where cultural context is everything. Because if you were a Greek philosopher walking around Athens in the first century, the logos meant something very specific to you.
It did.
It was an abstract, impersonal force. It was the rational principle keeping the universe in mathematical order, like the laws of physics or gravity. It had power, but it didn't have a personality. You couldn't exactly pray to the Greek logos. And that is the crucial distinction right there. The Hellenistic Greek mind saw the logos as a cosmic mechanism. But John is not a Greek philosopher. He is a first-century Jewish thinker.
Right.
So he's writing from a deeply Hebraic worldview. To a Jewish mind, the Word is the Torah. It is the pre-existing hypostatic wisdom of God. It is the creative, active utterance of the Almighty.
I mean, think back to the very first page of the Bible, the book of Genesis. God doesn't stand at a workbench and build the universe with his hands like a carpenter.
No, he speaks.
He speaks. He says, "Let there be light." He utters a word, and reality violently obeys. The Logos is the eternal idea of God, existing face-to-face with the Father from before time began.
He is the active agent of creation. And then John drops the ultimate theological paradox. He says this infinite, uncreated Word became flesh.
And there is a massive linguistic earthquake happening in the Greek text, right there, right between the concepts of being and becoming.
The linguistic shift is profound, because when John talks about the Word in eternity past, he uses the Greek state of en, which means absolute, continuous, unchangeable existence. But when he says the Word was made flesh, he uses the verb egeneto.
Which signifies a historical event, a transition.
Exactly, a transition. The infinite creator chose a historical becoming. He voluntarily entered into a brand new mode of existence.
I want to pause and wrestle with this for a second, because this is kind of the great stumbling block for human logic. How can you be the uncreated infinite God who holds the Andromeda galaxy together and simultaneously be a fragile, finite, created human being with a circulatory system?
It's a massive question.
Doesn't taking on human flesh imply a loss of divinity? I mean, if I pour the Pacific Ocean into a teacup, I lose the ocean. It sounds like a total contradiction.
Well, it is the mystery of the hypostatic union. But we have to be really precise here. Taking on human flesh does not mean he subtracted his deity. The ocean isn't being poured into a teacup. The ocean is choosing to experience what it is like to be a teacup without ever ceasing to be the ocean.
I like to visualize it with a modern analogy. Imagine a world-renowned Nobel Prize-winning quantum physicist. He is brilliant beyond measure, understanding the deepest mysteries of the universe. But one afternoon, he volunteers to teach a class of kindergartners. To communicate with them, he voluntarily restricts his vocabulary. He stops using complex mathematical equations. He sits in one of those tiny, uncomfortable plastic chairs. He plays with wooden blocks.
That captures the essence perfectly.
The physicist doesn't lose his genius, right?
Yeah.
His IQ doesn't magically drop to that of a 5-year-old. He doesn't cease to be a Nobel laureate, but he voluntarily adds a limitation to himself in order to communicate and connect intimately with those children. He enters their physical reality.
Exactly. He added humanity, a genuine human body, a human soul, and a human spirit. But he did it without subtracting a single fraction of his deity. He just restricted the independent exercise of certain divine attributes to fully accept the terrifying limitations of the human condition.
Wow. The creator of the cosmos reduced to a microscopic single cell in the womb of a young woman. And John goes on to say that he dwelt among us. But if we look at the original Greek, the word John chooses is just dripping with ancient Israelite history.
It really is. The Greek word is skinu.
Mm-hmm.
Translated literally, it means he pitched his tent, or more accurately, he tabernacled.
And if you are a first-century Jewish reader, the moment you read the word tabernacled, your mind instantly flashes back to the book of Exodus.
It's the most powerful callback imaginable for them. I mean, picture the Israelites wandering in the absolute desolation of the Sinai wilderness.
Yeah.
God commands them to build this highly specific, portable temple, the tabernacle.
And this wasn't some casual gathering place. This tent was terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. Inside the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, hidden behind a thick, heavy veil woven of animal skins, resided the Shekinah glory. The localized, blinding, consuming, manifest presence of an infinitely holy God. It was a place of deep reverence, a place of blood sacrifice. It was literally the only place where God interacted directly with a sinful people. And if you approached it incorrectly, it would cost you your life.
So when John says the word tabernacled among us, he is making a breathtaking claim. He is saying that the Shekinah glory doesn't live behind dead animal skins in a desert tent anymore.
Right. That ultimate manifest presence of God now resides in the living temple of human flesh.
Think about the intimacy of that for a second. God essentially moved into our neighborhood. He pitched his tent in the dirt of humanity's backyard. Before this, God was a pillar of fire in the night. He was a voice thundering from a shaking mountain that made the Israelites literally beg Moses to make it stop.
Yeah.
He was a presence so intensely holy it was lethal. But now you could sit across a campfire from him. You could watch the way the firelight reflected in his eyes. You could hear the specific timbre of his voice. You could pass him a piece of bread and actually watch him eat.
It signifies a divine desire for profound familiarity. The invisible God became historically, tangibly, and physically visible. John writes, "We beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father."
I'm really glad you brought up that phrase, only begotten, because I know it trips up a lot of modern readers. It sounds like God the Father gave birth to Jesus at a specific point in time, which totally contradicts the whole idea that the Word is eternal.
Yeah, that is a very common misunderstanding of the English translation.
Yeah.
Because the Greek word is monogenes. It does not mean biological reproduction. It does not mean he had a starting point.
Okay.
The word literally means one of a kind or unique, in essence. He is the unparalleled, unique Son who shares the exact uncreated essence of the Father. There is no one else in that category.
And this one-of-a-kind word brings what John calls grace and truth.
Right, which introduces a critical theological contrast between the Old Covenant and the new arrival. John is essentially presenting Jesus as the new Sinai.
So how does that contrast work practically?
Well, the law of Moses, given at Mount Sinai, was a magnificent, holy, and perfect standard. But functionally, for broken humanity, it acted as a diagnostic tool.
Like a medical diagnosis. Let's go back to the medical analogy. The law is basically an X-ray machine.
Perfect.
Ah.
The law takes a flawless X-ray of the human soul. It points out the jagged white line of a broken bone. It shows you exactly where the tumor is. It perfectly reveals where you have failed to meet God's standard of holiness.
Right.
But here's the limitation of an X-ray. It cannot heal the bone. It can only condemn the patient by revealing the disease. It cannot cure it.
The law is the policeman who pulls you over and writes you a ticket for speeding. It's totally just you broke the law, but the policeman isn't the paramedic who saves your life when you crash the car.
Exactly the right distinction. Jesus arrives as the overflowing embodiment of God's character. He brings truth, which is the ultimate reality that satisfies the mind and aligns with the X-ray. But he also brings grace.
And what does that look like?
Grace is the unmerited, active, divine favor that actually sets the broken bone, forgives the debt, and heals the soul. The law pointed to the terminal disease. The Word made flesh is the cure.
So John gives us this breathtaking cosmic theology, the uncreated logos tabernacling in human flesh. But here is the narrative problem. A cosmic theological view does not put a king on a physical throne in Jerusalem.
No, it doesn't.
Theology alone doesn't satisfy ancient earthly courts. To secure the royal title deed to the nation of Israel, God had to execute a highly technical legal maneuver. So we have to leave eternity and step directly into the rigid, unforgiving framework of a first-century Jewish rabbinical courtroom. We are shifting to Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 25.
And Matthew's entire agenda is relentlessly fixed on establishing the legal and royal perspective. He is writing to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Jesus is the legitimate, legal king of the Jews.
And to do that, Matthew drops us right into the middle on a massive legal crisis. Mary is espoused to Joseph, and before they come together, she is found with child. Now, we need to completely reset our modern cultural understanding here.
Yeah, we really do.
Espousal in first-century Judea was not like a modern engagement. It wasn't getting down on one knee with a diamond ring and setting a date for next summer.
It was an entirely different legal universe. In Jewish law, the marriage process had distinct formal stages. The espousal involved a legally binding, written covenant known as the ketubah, alongside the payment of a bride price, the mohar.
So to a rabbinical court, they were already legally married.
Absolutely. For all legal intents and purposes, they were husband and wife. The only difference was that they had not yet physically consummated the marriage, and the bride had not yet been formally brought into the groom's home.
Wow.
To break an espousal required a highly formal legal certificate of divorce. Actually, if Joseph had suddenly died during this waiting period, Mary would have been legally recognized as a widow.
When you understand that legal weight, the crisis becomes infinitely heavier. She is found with child. Now, Matthew immediately tells us, the reader, that this is of the Holy Spirit. It is the direct fulfillment of the ancient prophecy in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, the promised seed of the woman. But Joseph doesn't know that yet.
Right. Put yourself in Joseph's position. The text describes him as a dikaios, a just and righteous man. In that cultural context, righteous means he is deeply committed to obeying the Torah, the law of Moses.
And the law of Moses does not take infidelity lightly.
Under the strict letter of the law, specifically detailed in Deuteronomy chapter 22, infidelity during the espousal period was a grave capital offense. The law demanded a public trial before the elders at the city gates,
Which would have resulted in absolute public humiliation for Mary, dragging her family name through the mud and potentially ending in her execution by stoning.
And Joseph is agonizing in this profound dilemma. His sense of justice demands that he address the broken law. He cannot simply ignore what appears to be blatant unfaithfulness. But his righteousness is tempered by deep, profound mercy.
Right.
He loves her. He refuses to make her a public spectacle. So he resolves to pursue a quiet, private divorce, requiring only 2 witnesses, to quietly hand her the certificate and basically spare her life and dignity.
He is losing sleep over this. And while he is turning these things over in his mind, an angel of the Lord intervenes in a dream. And the very first phrase out of the angel's mouth is the absolute key to Matthew's entire legal argument. The angel says, "Joseph, thou son of David."
That is not a casual greeting. I mean, why not say, Joseph, the carpenter from Nazareth?
Right.
By invoking that specific title, son of David, the angel is deliberately activating Joseph's royal lineage. Joseph is the biological, direct line descendant of King David. He currently holds the legal rights to the royal line of succession.
And this introduces a massive theological roadblock, like one of the greatest paradoxes in the Old Testament, the curse of Jeconiah.
We find this devastating curse in Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 30. Jeconiah was an incredibly wicked king in the Davidic line, ruling just before the Babylonian Empire came and destroyed Jerusalem.
Okay.
He was so corrupt, so vile, that God pronounced a terrifying blood curse upon him.
Let's use an analogy here for the listener. Imagine a royal family's bloodline is like a highly complex computer software program. Jeconiah basically introduced a terminal virus into the root code.
That's a great way to think about it. God declared through the prophet Jeremiah that no biological descendant of Jeconiah would ever prosper sitting on the throne of David. He cursed the physical seed, the genetic line of this king forever.
But wait. God also made an unconditional, unbreakable covenant with King David centuries earlier, promising that a Messiah from David's line would rule forever. The Savior has to come from David.
Right.
But the royal line of succession passed down from David to Solomon, straight down through Jeconiah, and eventually, centuries later, straight down to Joseph the carpenter.
Do you see the trap God has seemingly set for himself? Since the royal line passed through Jeconiah, the biological blood curse is active. Any biological son produced by Joseph is permanently, irrevocably barred by God's own decree from sitting on the throne. The physical bloodline is completely disqualified.
This seems like an impossible legal knot. I mean, think about it. If Jesus is the biological son of Joseph, he inherits the curse of Jeconiah and cannot be the king. But if Jesus has absolutely no connection to Joseph, he has no legal right to the throne of David. How can God fulfill the promise to David without breaking his own righteous curse on Jeconiah?
This is where we witness the absolute brilliance of God's sovereign legal mind. I mean, the virgin birth is certainly a biological miracle,
Right.
but in Matthew's gospel, it functions as a flawless legal masterstroke.
Because Jesus is conceived by the Holy Spirit, he is exclusively the biological seed of the woman. He shares absolutely zero physical blood or genetic material with Joseph.
Exactly.
Therefore, he completely bypasses the corrupted root code. He bypasses the blood curse of Jeconiah. He is genetically untainted by it.
But that solves only half the problem. He avoids the curse. But how does he obtain the royal title deed? If he isn't Joseph's biological son, how does he get the legal right to the throne?
Exactly. How does a blue-collar carpenter in Nazareth have the legal authority to graft a miraculously conceived child into the most important royal bloodline in human history?
The answer lies deeply embedded in ancient Near Eastern law. The angel commands Joseph to execute two specific actions. First, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife. He must bring her into his home, finalize the marriage contract, and provide that vital legal umbrella of protection over her and the child.
And what's the second command?
The angel says, thou shalt call his name Jesus. In the ancient Jewish and Near Eastern legal framework, the formal act of a father naming a child was not just a nice naming ceremony. It constituted a legally binding, irrevocable adoption.
Oh, wow. That shifts the entire perspective. So by standing up in the community and officially conferring the name Yeshua upon the child, Joseph is legally adopting him as his own firstborn son.
And under that ancient legal code, an adopted son receives the exact same inheritance rights, the exact same titles, and the exact same status as a biological son.
Incredible.
By commanding Joseph to name the child, God orchestrates a magnificent legal loophole. Jesus inherits the absolute, unassailable legal right to the throne of David through Joseph's formal adoption, while totally circumventing the biological blood curse.
It is brilliant. The creator of the universe is also the ultimate lawyer, perfectly satisfying the demands of his own justice while keeping his promises. Now, I know there are critics out there. If you study theology at a university level, you will inevitably run into an academic view, often referred to as a midrashic interpretation.
Yes, it is a very common skeptical argument today. The theory claims that the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke are simply religious fiction.
Right.
The critics argue that the early Christian community simply mined the Old Testament for prophetic blueprints and then reverse-engineered fictional tales to give Jesus a mythical origin story to basically compete with Roman gods.
So how does the text hold up against that kind of academic skepticism?
It holds up remarkably well when you evaluate it critically. First, just look at the legal restraint of the text. Compare Matthew's account to the crass, cartoonish myths of pagan gods.
Right, like Greek mythology.
Yeah, in Greek mythology, when Zeus wants to produce a demigod, he takes physical form, often as an animal like a swan or a bull, and engages in physical relations with mortal women. It is hypersexualized and mythological.
But Matthew's account is completely devoid of that.
It is profoundly discreet, sober, and holy. It reads like a legal brief, not a mythological epic. Furthermore, the details in these chapters reflect a distinctly pre-Easter, deeply Jewish hope.
Explain what you mean by pre-Easter.
The language and expectations in Matthew chapter 1 are entirely focused on national restoration for Israel, fulfilling old covenants and dealing with Jewish legal matters. If the later Gentile-dominated church of the 2nd century had simply invented these stories from scratch, they would have written them to reflect their later, more developed universal theology.
That makes a lot of sense.
But the text remains stubbornly anchored in first-century Jewish legalism and historical reality. It is a genuine historical record of God's sovereign visitation.
And the angel makes the actual mission of this visitation crystal clear. He tells Joseph to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins.
And that is a critical distinction that the nation of Israel completely missed. They wanted a military conqueror to break the yoke of Rome. They wanted salvation from Caesar.
But Jesus came to deal with the spiritual rot first. I mean, you cannot put a new king on the throne if the nation's soul is still terminally ill.
Exactly.
The X-ray shows the cancer of sin. He came to save them from their sins before he would ever offer to save them from Rome.
The cosmic reality is established. The legal rights are secured. But biblical prophecy demands even more precision.
Which brings us to the geographic necessity of the arrival. We have John's cosmic reality and Matthew's legal rights. But the prophet Micah stated centuries earlier, in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, that the king had to be born in a specific tiny geographical location, Bethlehem of Judea.
And this presents a massive logistical problem for God's sovereign plan. Joseph and Mary live in Nazareth, up in the northern region of Galilee. Bethlehem is far down south, in the region of Judea.
So we shift our lens to the Gospel of Luke. Because Luke is the historian, he anchors the narrative in the cold, hard, geopolitical reality of the Roman Empire. We're looking at Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7.
And Luke immediately zooms out and introduces us to Caesar Augustus. At this exact moment in history, Augustus is the undisputed most powerful man on the face of the earth. He has ended a brutal series of Roman civil wars, transitioned Rome from a republic to an empire, and ushered in the Pax Romana.
Which was basically a global peace maintained by the absolute brutality of the Roman legions.
Right. And Augustus is sitting in his marble palace in Rome, thousands of miles away, and he issues a sweeping bureaucratic decree. He wants the entire known world to be registered. He wants a census. He wants to count his subjects so he can efficiently tax them to fund his massive military machine.
The irony here is thick. Augustus truly believes he is the master of human history. He thinks he is moving nations and shaping the future with the stroke of a pen. But from a biblical perspective, Augustus is merely an unwitting pawn on God's playing board.
God essentially uses the arrogant, corrupt, lumbering machinery of a pagan empire to force a peasant carpenter and his pregnant teenage wife to take a road trip to fulfill a 700-year-old prophecy.
Wow.
Because Roman census practices in client kingdoms like Herod's often required people to return to their ancestral tribal homes to register. Because Joseph was of the house and lineage of David, he was legally compelled by imperial law to travel to the city of David.
Which is Bethlehem, a town whose name literally translates to the house of bread.
A profoundly fitting birthplace for the one who would later declare himself to be the bread of life.
But I really want you to imagine the reality of this journey. We sanitize this so much in our minds. We sing Christmas carols that make it sound like a peaceful sleigh ride.
It was anything but.
This was a grueling, dangerous 70 to 90-mile trek. They would have to leave Nazareth, descend into the deep, sweltering heat of the Jordan River Valley to bypass Samaria, and then endure a steep, arduous physical climb up into the rocky hill country of Judea.
They're traveling on foot, perhaps with a donkey from Mary. They're navigating rocky terrain, trying to avoid highway bandits that plagued those routes, and dealing with completely unpredictable elements.
And Mary is 9 months pregnant. I want you to think about the physical toll of that, the exhaustion, the dust, the swelling, the fear. This is brutal, unforgiving first-century travel.
And they finally arrive in Bethlehem, completely exhausted. And this brings us to one of the most culturally misunderstood scenes in the entire Bible.
Let's deconstruct the nativity scene, because the standard story we are all told is that they get to town, knock on the door of a commercial inn, and a grumpy, greedy innkeeper points to a no vacancy sign and banishes them to a snowy, detached wooden barn out back where the animals are kept.
Right.
That is completely historically inaccurate, isn't it?
It is entirely inaccurate. The translation of the Greek text into English over the centuries has heavily influenced that false image. The Greek word translated as inn in Luke's gospel is katalima.
So what does katalima actually mean in the first century context?
It means guest room or upper room. In fact, it is the exact same Greek word Luke uses later in chapter 2 of his gospel to describe the upper room where Jesus and the disciples eat the Last Supper.
Okay, wow.
It specifically refers to a furnished guest chamber within a private family residence.
Okay, but if someone wanted to describe a commercial hotel or a roadside inn, was there a Greek word for that?
Yes, there was. The word is Pandošian. And we know Luke knew that word because he uses that exact word in chapter 10 during the parable of the Good Samaritan, when the Samaritan pays the innkeeper to take care of the wounded man.
Right.
But Luke deliberately does not use that word here in the birth narrative.
So there is no commercial hotel, there is no neon sign, and there's no mean innkeeper turning them away.
Let's look at the historical and cultural context. Joseph is returning to his ancestral family home. In ancient Near Eastern culture, hospitality was paramount. It was a sacred duty. Turning a pregnant relative away to sleep in a field or detached barn would bring unimaginable shame upon the entire family.
So they went directly to the home of their relatives.
Exactly. They went directly to their family.
But the text clearly says there was no room for them in the Catalima, the guest room. Why?
Because of Augustus's imperial census. Hundreds of people from the lineage of David were returning to Bethlehem at the exact same time. The family home was packed. The upper guest room, the Catalima, was already completely full of older, more prominent, perhaps elderly relatives who had arrived earlier.
So if the guest room is full and they aren't cast out into a barn, where exactly do they go?
Well, we have to understand the specific architecture of a typical first-century Judean peasant house. It was a split-level structure. The family lived, slept, and cooked on the upper raised level of the house. But just a few steps down, inside the exact same house, under the same roof, was a lower domestic area.
And what was the architectural purpose of that lower level?
At night, particularly during the colder months, families would bring their valuable, vulnerable animals, a family donkey, a few sheep, maybe a small cow, into this lower domestic space. It served two purposes. First, it protected their most valuable assets from predators and thieves. Second, it provided thermodynamics.
Ah, the heat.
Right. The body heat of the animals would naturally rise and help warm the upper living quarters of the house.
So because the upper guest room is full of relatives, Joseph and Mary are brought into the main house, but they have to find whatever privacy and space they can in the lower domestic level, right alongside the family's animals.
That is where Mary goes into the agonies of labor. Not in silent isolation, but in the crowded, noisy, earthy lower level of a relative's split-level house, surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of agricultural life.
And then we come to the manger. The text says she wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger. The Greek word is phatne.
A manger is simply a feeding trough for animals. And in the rocky region of Judea, it wasn't a quaint, wooden, hay-lined cradle constructed by a carpenter. It was typically a crude box carved directly out of a solid block of limestone or built permanently into the stone floor of that lower level.
I really want you to sit with that image. The creator of the universe, the uncreated Logos, takes his very first human breath in an animal's living quarters. And his first bed is a rock-hard, cold limestone feeding trough that likely smelled of animal saliva and crushed grain.
The theological symbolism embedded in that historical reality is staggering.
Wait, so if humanity is degraded by sin, is Luke deliberately placing the bread of life in a literal animal feeding trough to make a theological point about sustenance?
That is precisely the point. The biblical narrative from Genesis onward consistently shows that humanity, through sin and rebellion, has degraded itself. We were created to bear the divine image, to rule as vice-regents over creation.
Right.
But sin has reduced us. We operate on base appetites, survival of the fittest, violence, and instinct. We have in many ways degraded into beasts.
So the king arrives in this cold, beast-like world.
Yes. And he doesn't demand a silver platter in Augustus's marble palace in Rome. He is placed precisely in the feeding trough, the exact place where the beasts come to feed. He offers himself, the bread of life born in the house of bread, as the ultimate spiritual sustenance to restore degraded humanity back to our original glorious design.
That is profound. And Luke adds one more specific historical detail. He mentions the swaddling clothes.
Swaddling clothes were tight strips of cloth used in the ancient world to bind a newborn's limbs securely. It was believed to give them a sense of security, mimicking the womb, and to ensure their limbs grew straight.
But there's a historical echo there, too, linking back to Joseph's royal lineage.
Absolutely. Ancient wisdom literature from that era, specifically the Wisdom of Solomon, records that King Solomon himself, the great Davidic king of Israel's golden age, was also carefully wrapped in swaddling clothes at birth.
So Luke is subtly linking this helpless baby in the limestone trough to the greatest, wealthiest king in Israel's history. Even in supreme physical frailty, completely dependent on a teenage mother, he is unmistakably marked as the true Davidic royalty.
It is the ultimate picture of purposeful humiliation to fulfill the covenant promises.
So we have examined the three lenses. We have seen the cosmic lens of John, the eternal word tabernacling in human flesh. We've seen the legal lens of Matthew, the brilliant adoption that bypasses a corrupted bloodline. And we have seen the historical lens of Luke, a Roman census leading to a limestone feeding trough.
Yes.
But if we leave these as three separate, isolated stories, we miss the actual architecture of God's plan.
We must synthesize this narrative. To understand what this arrival actually means for us today, we have to look at the specific administrative era, the dispensational timeline in which these events occurred.
I want to push back here on behalf of the listener, because I think this is where massive theological confusion happens in modern culture. A lot of well-meaning people assume that the moment Jesus is born in that manger, the biblical clock just magically resets.
They do assume
They
that.
assume the Old Testament ends on that page, the strict law of Moses is immediately canceled, and the era of pure, unmerited grace instantly begins right there in Bethlehem. Let's clarify the timeline. Is that what happened?
That is absolutely not what happened. And failing to understand that leads to immense confusion when reading the Gospels. To understand the timeline, we need to use the critical interpretive key provided by the Apostle Paul later in the New Testament.
Okay.
In Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, Paul writes a profound summary of the Incarnation. He says, "But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law."
Made under the law. That phrase changes everything about how we read the birth narrative.
It is the crucial interpretive lens. Think of the timeline of the Bible as a series of stewardships or administrative eras where God manages his household under a specific set of rules. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem, the era of the Mosaic Law was still 100% fully active.
So all 613 commandments of the Mosaic Law, the strict dietary restrictions, the Sabbath laws, the temple sacrifices, the purity rituals, they were all fully in effect the night he was born.
Entirely in effect.
Huh.
Jesus was born into that active stewardship. He submitted perfectly to the very law he himself had authored. He was circumcised on the 8th day, strictly according to the law. He was presented in the temple in Jerusalem, strictly according to the law. Mary offered the prescribed sacrifice for purification.
He didn't just wave a divine magic wand and cancel the rules because they were difficult.
No, he could not cancel them. He had to perfectly fulfill them. Paul elaborates on the specific focus of Christ's earthly life in Romans chapter 15, verse 8. He says that Jesus Christ was a minister of the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made unto the fathers.
A minister to the circumcision. That is a highly specific demographic. That means his earthly ministry, as recorded in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, was directed specifically and exclusively to the physical covenant nation of Israel.
Yes, he came to fulfill what we call the prophetic program. Since the days of Abraham in the book of Genesis, God had been prophesying through the patriarchs and the prophets that a literal earthly geopolitical kingdom would be established for Israel, ruled by a Davidic king. Jesus came to offer that exact kingdom.
This connects perfectly to what the angel told Joseph back in Matthew. He shall save his people from their sins, his people being the Jewish nation.
Exactly. He had to fulfill the legal and prophetic requirements for Israel first.
I want to contrast this carefully with what comes later in the biblical timeline, because today, you and I, the listeners, are not living under the strict requirements of the Mosaic Law. We aren't offering animal sacrifices. We are living in a completely different administrative era.
This is a vital, necessary distinction for rightly dividing the text. The current era we live in, where Jew and Gentile are absolute equals, forming a new spiritual entity, saved entirely by grace without any works of the law. That was a complete secret at the time of the Nativity.
The Apostle Paul calls it a mystery.
Yes, a mystery kept secret since the world began. You cannot find this current era of grace in the Old Testament prophets. You cannot find it in the covenants with Abraham or David. And you certainly cannot find it in the manger in Bethlehem. It had not yet begun.
God was keeping it entirely under wraps.
Jesus first had to perfectly fulfill the old contract of the law. He had to fulfill every prophecy, live a sinless life under the immense crushing pressure of the law down to the very last letter. Only after that old contract was fully satisfied through his subsequent death on the cross and his resurrection could the new contract of grace be revealed to Paul and offered to the whole world.
I love how this framework proves that God is a God of absolute, unshakable order. He literally fulfills his literal promises. He doesn't just panic when humanity fails, scrap the blueprint, and suddenly change the rules.
No, he satisfies the rules completely. He navigated the impossible legal curses of Jeremiah, the massive geopolitical maneuvers of the Roman Empire, and the microscopic, strict demands of the Mosaic Law to prove his absolute faithfulness to his word.
Think about the peace that brings to you, the listener. If God goes to those staggering, universe-bending lengths, orchestrating an imperial Roman census, bypassing a corrupted blood curse through ancient adoption laws, tabernacling in a limestone feeding trough just to keep his promises to Israel, then you can absolutely trust him to keep his promises of grace to you today.
His character is flawless. The history might look like muddy waters to us at times, but his timeline is absolutely perfect.
We have covered an enormous amount of ground today. Let's do a quick recap. We started by breaking the silence of 400 years of trauma and waiting. We looked through John's cosmic lens and saw the uncreated logos pitching a tent in human flesh, bringing the paramedic of grace and truth into the neighborhood.
Then we entered Matthew's rabbinical courtroom and witnessed the brilliant legal maneuver of the virgin birth and adoption, bypassing the blood curse of Jeconiah to secure the royal title deed to the throne.
We traveled with Luke down the dusty, dangerous road from Nazareth to Bethlehem, seeing God use the arrogance of Caesar Augustus to bring the bread of life to a limestone feeding trough in the crowded lower level of a peasant house.
And finally, we synthesized it all through the timeline of Scripture, seeing how Christ was born under the law to perfectly fulfill it, setting the stage for the later revelation of the mystery of grace.
It is a breathtaking, multi-dimensional picture. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought, something for you to mull over as you go about your week, something that builds on the sheer physical humanity of this story.
What is that final detail?
It's a single word found in Matthew chapter 1, verse 25. The text says that Joseph knew her not until she had brought forth her firstborn son. I want you to focus your mind entirely on that word. Until...
A very specific restrictive marker of time.
It is. The clear biblical reality, which is heavily supported elsewhere in the Gospels, is that normal, healthy marital relations followed between Joseph and Mary after the birth. Jesus did not grow up as an isolated only child in a silent, pristine, glowing shrine. He grew up as the oldest brother in a house full of younger siblings. The texts later name them explicitly: James, Jude, Simon, and his sisters.
It was a profoundly noisy, crowded household.
I want you to really imagine the sheer commonplace humanity of the creator of the universe growing up in a noisy, crowded, split-level house in Nazareth. Imagine him having to navigate complex sibling dynamics, having to share limited space, watching his younger brothers scrape their knees and helping him up, experiencing the ordinary sweat of the carpentry shop, the daily frustrations of human communication, the financial pressures of a blue-collar family, and the ordinary joys of a shared meal.
He truly intimately entered into the human experience.
He didn't parachute into history as a fully formed adult, floating 3 feet above the dirt, wearing a halo, completely immune to the irritations of daily life. He lived the entire messy, exhausting, glorious human experience from infancy upward. I want you to ponder what that means about him. His ability to intimately and experientially sympathize with the absolute ordinary reality of your daily life today. He gets it because he lived it.
He is not a distant deity who cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. And he lived in the dirt with us.
God doesn't just work in sterile clinical environments. He does his greatest, most profound healing work right in the middle of the crowded guest rooms, the dusty roads, and the messy realities of our lives. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep exploring the text, and keep looking for those moments where eternity intersects your daily life. Until next time.